Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Flipp The Script podcast, brought to you by FlipGen. I'm Paddy, and I'm hosting this podcast alongside Kaz and Cosima. Today, we have the immense honour of being joined by George Billinge. We're so excited to talk to George about all things regulating online safety, the Online Safety Act, and the role of Ofcom. And as always, with Flipp The Script, we'll cover three main topics with George before we flip the script and ask him for some input on FlipGen. George is co-founder and CEO of Illuminate Tech, which is a bespoke research and advisory firm working to cultivate a safer, more trusted internet. Its product makes online safety risk assessments, and its founder are former members of Ofcom's online safety group. As well as that, George is a former Ofcom policy manager, and therefore he has a really unique perspective when it comes to digital regulation, having worked for the UK's online safety regulator and also coordinated Ofcom's efforts to build age verification technologies. Welcome, George. I'll start off with the questions. A lot of our listeners are teens, and they probably heard of the Online Safety Act, and probably, as I said earlier, it's one of those things that not a lot of what politicians do gets cut through and young people see, but this has certainly been one that I've seen loads on social media. So could you give like a brief explanation of what it is, how it works, what its intentions are, and that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Paddy, and thanks for having me on. I think the first thing to say is maybe a bit about Ofcom and what Ofcom do and what Ofcom don't do, because I think this causes quite a lot of confusion. And then I can go into the Online Safety Act in a bit more detail. So something that's really important to be aware of is the fact that Ofcom don't actually draft the legislation. That's the job of elected parliamentarians in government. They draft the legislation and it passes through the House. So that's a democratic process where elected representatives draft the legislation. What Ofcom have to do is take that legislation, and it is a mammoth piece of legislation. I think it's the most amended piece of legislation in the UK's history. So that means it's the piece of legislation where members of the House of Lords in particular have kind of reviewed the legislation as it passes through Parliament and said, we want this to change, we want that to change, this bit should be added in, bit should be taken out. Once it gets granted something called royal assent, which is where the Queen or now King says, okay, I approve of this, it gets enacted into law and it moves from being the Online Safety Bill to an Online Safety Act. At that point, Ofcom's job is to look at the legislation and produce things called regulatory codes and guidance, which help companies, help regulated services understand what they need to do to comply with the Act. So that's the first thing. Ofcom is an independent regulator. Their job is to set out guidelines for regulated services to help them understand what do I need to do to get compliant with the legislation. A bit about the Online Safety Act itself. As said, it's a mammoth piece of legislation. And there are some really tricky bits within it. And some people might argue there are some contradictions within the approach of the Online Safety Act itself. Fundamentally, the main thing that regulated services have to do is assess the risk of harm taking place on their platform. So the first thing they have to do is something called an illegal harms risk assessment. So there's 17 kinds of harm set out on the face of the Online Safety Act. These are illegal harms, so they range from things like terrorism to child sexual abuse, some really nasty harms. Platforms have a duty to assess the risk of all of these things happening on their platform. They have to use good quality evidence about, have we seen this happening already on our platform, or is the nature of our platform, do the features and functionalities mean that this kind of thing is likely to happen? So for example, if you share your location by default on a particular app, and if strangers can randomly slide into your DMs, whether or not they've sent you a friend request and you've accepted that, or add you to group chats, these things might all lead to an increased risk of stalking or harassment or things like that. So that's the first step, a risk assessment. How does our platform pose a risk of harm to our users? And then what can we do to mitigate those risks? The bit that has caused a lot of controversy recently, and which I'm really interested to ask you guys about actually, are what's called the child safety duties. So you have to do something called a children's access assessment. Everyone has to do this. That's basically answering the question, are children on my platform, or are children likely to access my platform? If they are, then you have to do the children's risk assessment. And this is where you have to assess the risk of different harms to children taking place on your platform. So some of these things are quite simple. They're things which are legal, like pornography, for example, and there you have to make sure that children are not able to access that specifically through age verification. Other things are a bit less tangible, like cyberbullying, and you have to implement proportionate systems and processes to try to reduce the risk of those things happening on your platform. The reason it's been so complicated and caused such an uproar since these rules went live, really, is because there's thousands of pages of regulatory codes and guidance, because I said the act is massive, it's really complicated. And what tech platforms have to do, if you're a social media platform, say you're Reddit or Instagram, you have to look through all of this. And then you have to make decisions, firstly, about whether specific types or pieces of content are illegal or not, and should this be taken down or shouldn't it be taken down? But secondly, is this harmful to children? And how can we regulate whether or not children are able to access this kind of content? So that's in very broad brushstrokes, the Online Safety Act. The fundamental thing is assess the risk of harm to your users and then identify what you need to do to reduce the risk of those harms taking place. The big famous thing has been age verification, right? Where if you're a site which primarily offers adult content, then you have to implement age verification. And there's been a lot of consternation, which I'm sure we'll get onto, about the fact that people can use VPNs to circumvent this, or it's not effective, or its effectiveness can change for people of different characteristics. We can come on to talk about all of that, but I've been speaking for far too long. I will pause there. That's my brief intro to the Online Safety Act.
No, thank you for that. It's such a complex piece of legislation, and I think it's really important to actually explain that the difference between Ofcom and how this was implemented. And you said it's like a democratic process, and it was actually a democratic process which started in the last government. So I think it's really important to describe that. Do you think there's a role for more kind of less guidance and more kind of, I guess, harsher regulation and saying you have to have this, you have to have that? Or do you think that it's better to offer the guidance and allow tech companies to develop their own systems to follow that guidance?
So there are certain parts of the Online Safety Act where you do have to do things. So for example, where you are aware of illegal content and of specific forms of illegal content, there are rules which say you have to swiftly take down that content, which I think is right. So for example, the most harmful forms of abuse material which get shared online, if you become aware of that as a platform, you do have to take that down. But you have to have systems, what's called systems and processes in the Act, which will enable that to be taken down quickly. To answer your question more holistically, I suppose, regulators always have to strike a really fine balance. The most oppressive societies, you could argue, are the most strictly regulated societies, right? You've got to think really carefully about freedom of expression. You've got to think about children's rights to access information and educational resources. One of the more concerning things we've seen potentially as a result of the Online Safety Act is LGBTQ plus communities online, potentially people having access to them restricted. My big sister is a trans woman, and she was really heavily reliant on Reddit at the beginning of her transition for access to information. And I've kind of tried to think through the process of doing a risk assessment for Reddit, and I can see how it's really challenging because some potentially harmful information could be shared towards children on some of these platforms. At the same time, you've got to get that balance right between ensuring people have access to educational material, but also that they can dissent and disagree and express themselves freely in a private manner, right? You don't want people to feel surveilled all the time on the internet. So I think for the most egregious forms of harm, where there's clear rules where you have to take things down, the more guidance you can give on how to do that, the better, probably. So there are certain types of material out there on the internet that simply shouldn't be there, in my opinion. And I think the vast majority of people would agree should not be there. There was a terrorist attack in Christchurch in New Zealand, which was live streamed over Facebook Live. And that was allowed to happen for several minutes before it was taken down. I think most people would say that shouldn't happen because then it was clipped up and shared on kind of far-right white nationalist internet forums all over the internet, basically as propaganda. However, where you get into this more grey area, where it's kind of like Am I starting to explore certain aspects of my identity? Am I trying to access educational resources? That's where I think it is appropriate for the regulator to take a step back and be a bit more flexible and say, we really want to give you space to think carefully about the importance of privacy in this particular context and the importance of freedom of expression. So again, it's one of those places where you really need smart regulation and you can't really have broad sweeping rules that apply to every kind of harm in the same way.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important to get that balance. And like you say, a lot of the most regulated aren't good places to live generally. And also the same is a lack of regulation can be really dangerous as well. On that point, one of the things about the Online Safety Act is quite pioneering, and there's not been too many other countries implementing. I think Australia and France kind of have previously implemented similar things. But do you see this as do you think this is a kind of a step forwards and a first of many countries adopting similar measures, or do you think this is going to be kind of one country? Do you think other countries might wait and see how it does before implementing similar legislation?
So I think outside of the US in particular, there's definitely momentum towards regulating online services. The United States at the moment is a whole different picture because, you've got a president and particularly a vice president in the website who are framing all attempts to regulate tech platforms as a massive infringement of freedom of speech and an anti-American endeavor and all that kind of stuff. So that the Trump White House really doesn't like the idea of regulating American tech companies, which is probably to be expected. More broadly, I think, there's momentum behind regulating tech companies. I think people are aware that we've had these, tech platforms, which when they were originally built, if we're being really honest with ourselves, were built not necessarily for benevolent purposes, right? When they first kind of appeared, the business model wasn't clear. How would these platforms make money? Now it is clear. You capture user attention, you try and profile your users, you put them into particular kind of personality boxes, and then you target them with adverts. That causes a ton of harms. We don't have much agency or control over how our personal data is being processed and used and sold. And there are very legitimate concerns, actually, that aspects of the Online Safety Act might increase the amount of personal data that's being processed about people and, exacerbate those harms. Now, I think those concerns can be addressed around age verification, for example. That's a big area where people are saying, well, you're requiring more data to be collected. How can that be a good thing? But actually, as long as you've got really good certification schemes and you're testing the age assurance and having it done in a privacy preserving way, and that tech is out there, then you can use age assurance and then say, okay, because this person is under the age of 18, we know it's actually illegal to target them with certain kinds of ads, which could be harmful. The short answer to your question is, yes, there's a lot of momentum around regulating tech companies. I think it's really interesting that we're seeing different approaches in different countries. So Australia has been criticized quite a lot for one aspect, I should say it's just one aspect of their regulatory regime, is banning social media accounts for under 16s. The DSA, the Digital Services Act, which is the EU's big piece of legislation regulating tech companies, does look a bit more at this kind of harmful algorithms side of things than the Online Safety Act does. And then the Online Safety Act has the kind of process I just set out. I think we need to allow governments to have a go, to see what works and see what doesn't, learn lessons, and try and make this better over time. Because for me, it's really clear that doing nothing is also a choice. Kind of accepting the status quo is also a choice. And I don't think tech companies are going to suddenly decide that they're going to take online harms really seriously and try and create healthy, safe spaces for people of all ages.
It's an exciting time because we get to see what other governments do and kind of compare. I'm going to pass over to Kaz now to talk a bit more. I think we covered it a little bit, but a bit more of the criticisms around the Online Safety Act.
Yes, hello. I do just want to say again, thank you so much for coming on. We are going to inevitably have to talk about the criticisms, what is fair, what is not. I think you have a really interesting and actually really insightful perspective on this. You have touched on quite a lot of what I'm going to say, so I wouldn't want you to repeat yourself, but obviously if you can add on to some of the stuff I think we've already discussed. In your recent piece for The Guardian, you note your concern about the impact of an unregulated online world, which is something we wholeheartedly agree with here at FlipGen. You mentioned platforms' roles in disseminating racist and misinformation during the riots last year, which is something I absolutely agree with. However, obviously, there are quite a few issues with the Online Safety Act. First, something that a lot of people are really concerned with are the significant privacy risks that come with. The responsibility lies really with individual platforms to source age verification through services which are often based in places where there's really not any regulation. And obviously those are accessing data from UK citizens. I know you've touched on this, but do you have any sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is the Online Safety Act doesn't exist in a vacuum. In the UK, we have the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, and we've just passed a new piece of data protection regulation, actually. And all of the age verification companies, if a platform is using an age verification company, they should be complying with the data protection regulation in the UK. That means they have to identify a lawful basis for processing data. There's additional requirements for processing children's data, which is set out in a document called the Children's Code from the ICO, which basically says how GDPR applies to children's data. And so I think there's definitely, again, there's this question, does the ICO have the capacity to adequately regulate all of these age assurance providers? Should the state be doing more? If the state is effectively mandating the deployment of a potentially intrusive technology across all online services, should the state be doing more to support research into them, to testing, adversarial testing? I think the answer is yes. I think if the state is mandating the deployment of relatively novel technology, the state should be much more involved in drafting really high quality standards and scrutinizing the companies behind this. I've seen suggestions of the state even providing some free age assurance tech, which is good enough for the lower risk services out there. I think all these options should be explored, and to lay my cards on the table, I think the state should have a bolder industrial strategy for the tech sector in general. I think a priority for Ofcom and the ICO should be working really closely together to look at what age assurance solutions have been deployed out there and really interrogate their privacy policies, what they're doing to protect user data. In theory, age assurance doesn't even need to know your date of birth. They don't need to know how old you are. They need to go through some process, which could be anything, to establish that you're above or below a particular age threshold. And then they can delete all of your personal data and just share a binary yes or no decision token effectively with whatever service you're trying to access. That should be the standard in my view. Now, the challenge is, do you have to do that every single time you access a service? And what's the impact on freedom of expression? Is there a chilling effect on freedom of expression? Are people going to get used to scanning their face to access things? Yes, I think we should think about all these things. I think the state should think about interoperable infrastructures for age assurance and things like this. I don't want to get too technical. But again, I think when there is really harmful content out there, and sites which are legal but full of things that you probably shouldn't be seeing at 10, 11 years old, and people are currently starting to be exposed to them really young, I don't really think it's good enough to sit on our hands and say this problem is too hard, we should do nothing about it. Tech companies for decades have been saying, let's move fast and break things. And if governments are finally adopting that attitude a little bit more, I don't think that's necessarily a terrible thing.
Thank you. I think this actually leads quite nicely into our next question, because you've talked about interrogating platforms rather than repealing the legislation. You've talked about how obviously teething issues are going to happen. We do have to try and test things. I think a problem that people have sort of fundamentally is the guidance is non-specific in the way that platforms are being policed on how to hone their approach. So sometimes they may be utilizing this act to censor what they see fit to maybe align with the interests of whoever might own those companies, for example, like X or Twitter. You've talked about obviously, I was actually going to bring that up, like in terms of Reddit, in terms of forums for LGBTQ plus content. We're seeing the mass censorship of Palestinian journalism much more than we were seeing before the act was put in place. And this issue really is spanning sort of the entirety of the digital world. So even, Wikipedia has been fighting legally with the UK government. So would you say that the problem lies within sort of the guidance itself, or would you say it's how these companies are interpreting it?
It's a really good question, and I think it's really hard to answer without seeing the internal processes of these companies. The easy thing for me to say, as someone who is instinctively supportive of the idea of regulating tech platforms, would be tech platforms have been slashing budgets in their trust and safety departments, in their regulatory compliance departments, particularly after the recent election of Donald Trump to the White House. The safety budget has massively been slashed. In my view, it wouldn't be completely unfair to suggest that that might mean the quality of risk assessments might decrease, and the way you implement the technologies that you decide to implement, whether that's content moderation or other things, might be slightly less effective than it otherwise could be. I've also seen some people online suggest that, taking a heavy-handed approach to content moderation and pointing towards the Online Safety Act as the reason you've done it would be a convenient way to undermine the idea of any regulation of the tech sector altogether. That's a line I have heard from some people, which is maybe worth considering. In my opinion, the censorship of Palestinian journalists, I think, is a huge issue. I think that there are some issues which people are pointing towards the Online Safety Act to explain that are far broader than the Online Safety Act. So if we talk about censorship in Palestine, we've seen a huge number of war crimes. Pretty much every genocide scholar out there says they think that a genocide is happening. More journalists have been killed in this conflict than in any other conflict in history. A recent report has come out about how the BBC has covered Palestine, which shows that, for example, they pretty much never use the word massacre when a massacre takes place. Pro-Palestine content was being censored on social media platforms prior to the passage of the Online Safety Act. I haven't seen research about how that censorship has changed post and pre-Online Safety Act, and I'd be really interested to read something about that because that's not something I was aware of. So yes, the Online Safety Act has obviously had a big impact on how content is moderated online, but I think it's actually a lot more complicated than simply the Online Safety Act has passed and therefore now I can't access this particular type of content.
Thank you. I think that really puts it into perspective. And I think, as you say, in terms of seeing proof of how this has changed, what you can and can't see, it really is too soon to tell. There has been a lot of chat as well about the increased use of VPNs to bypass the Online Safety Act, often to access content that has maybe been sort of unrightfully censored at the moment. However, this loophole obviously does mean that children can still access pornography. Do you think we can fix this loophole? And if we can, how so?
I think it's interesting calling it a loophole, right? So using VPNs to access content which has been restricted, which shouldn't have been restricted, is quite an interesting one because firstly, I think it's unfortunately too early to see evidence on how people are using VPNs and why. And that will be something that is really interesting to see eventually. For me, where you have platforms where you're already creating an account, you're already giving over your personal details, your email address, you have to log in, you have to sign up when you join. These are social media platforms, the kind of platforms where people are perhaps a bit more concerned about legitimate content being censored. That's where instinctively I feel like people will be using VPNs a bit less. I might be wrong about this, but I wouldn't necessarily want my social media platform to think I'm in a different country because then I'll get served content as if I'm in a different country and I want to be served content that is relevant to me. Also, age verification doesn't add way more friction into my user journey because I can do it when I'm signing up for an account. I have to do other things. I might have to do two-factor authentication and verify my email address when I'm signing up for an account. So for me, age verification where you're signing up for an account, that's probably the context where it's more effective. If people are using VPNs to work around it there in a big way, I think that's something really interesting and concerning and something that should be looked into. In terms of to access adults only platforms, porn platforms are basically the main ones, right? There's a few different ways you can approach this. One approach would be you should, BBC iPlayer and Netflix can tell if you're using a VPN now. If you go to a certain country and you try to access BBC iPlayer using a VPN, it will say, sorry, we think you're using a VPN. Please turn your VPN off before accessing our service. I'll be completely honest, I don't know loads about the tech that does that, and I don't know what the implications are on privacy. I don't know what geolocation data they're using. And so I don't feel comfortable confidently saying, yes, we should do this for porn sites as well, because I'd want to understand how that tech works better. But taking a step back from that, if you have to go and download a VPN and sign up for a VPN, maybe pay for one, I know there's a bunch of free VPNs out there as well, you're still adding a lot of friction in the user journey between thinking about, I want to go on this kind of site and access this kind of content and actually going there. And what that does is it means that you're actually thinking about what you're doing and why you're doing it more as you're doing it, rather than just kind of mindlessly going and searching for this kind of content. And I still think that's probably a good thing, particularly where you see much younger children, potentially, I'm going to use the word addicted. You know, scholars of addiction feel very strongly about what is and isn't technically an addiction. But where people are demonstrating, addictive behaviors towards certain types of content at a very young age, I think having that kind of friction is a good thing. I also think more probably needs to be done to raise awareness about VPNs and how privacy preserving they actually are or aren't. Because a lot of VPNs, people raise concerns about age assurance providers gathering your data and selling your data onwards. I'm sure there are age assurance providers out there who do that. As said, there are also ones who definitely don't and do delete all of your personal data that they don't absolutely need and are really secure. And there should be processes in place to make sure that those are the ones that are being used by companies. VPNs are not regulated at all. They can gather your personal data about all of your internet traffic and sell it on to data brokers who then basically chop up and combine your data with other data and sell it to different shady companies around the internet. This has also been highlighted as a big flaw of the Online Safety Act, that it has encouraged the adoption of VPNs, and this leads to greater cybersecurity risks. I think a lot of people have said because of this, the solution to really young children being exposed to huge volumes of porn and learning about sex and relationships that way in an unhealthy manner, the solution to that is just education rather than any interventions from government. Fine, but I also think education is the answer to every single policy issue ever, if you actually think about it. Loads of parents are really struggling at the moment. It's really hard to know what your kids are doing online. It's really hard to place that burden on parents. And when that harm comes from tech companies designing their platforms irresponsibly in order to make profit, I think it's unfair to ask parents to take up that whole burden themselves as well. So then if we're going to have this debate and say, we shouldn't use age verification because people use VPNs, instead we should have education. You could equally say, well, we should educate people about VPNs and age assurance and the implications of data protection and cybersecurity from using VPNs. I suppose I haven't really addressed the loophole fully because I think we need to see more data about who is using age verification in which different contexts and what workarounds are being used where and why. But I think for the first time, we're going to have that data. We're going to have more information about that. And then we can make better policy. And I think that's a good thing.
Thank you. I think given where we are at right now, I think that's a pretty fair answer to give. I think, again, we don't necessarily have all the data or the information on how people are using these services. I'm going to move on to sort of AI chatbots and companions, which is something there's been a lot of talk about as well. Obviously, with our new campaign For Us, we're looking at bumping up the sort of age restriction for using AI chatbots. And they aren't currently subject to the same restrictions as pornography sites yet. We've had leaked data from Meta this week, which clearly shows that their AI is permitted to have sensual and romantic chats with young people. We know this isn't the only offender. There's platforms such as CAI, which have led to young people's mental health really been damaged. I've seen a lot of articles about that as well. Furthermore, we know that these chatbots are also being used by young people as therapists or life advice. And chatbot usage, furthermore, has a really incredibly detrimental impact on our brains from this new data that we're seeing. Why do you think there's that perceived irregularity in regulation between sort of these AI chatbots, which can be really harmful and can have sexual conversations, and then pornographic sites? Do you think that's due to sort of a lack of education? Do you think it's just because it's something really new that the government doesn't know about?
I think it's because it's something really new. This tech has advanced massively in the past 12 months. It's something, regulation takes time to get right. We're seeing, how long the Online Safety Act took to pass through Parliament, and then how long it's taken Ofcom to draft the codes and guidance. That was a process of years. You pointed out it was the last government who started it. These chatbots can be developed and pushed out there in a few months or less. Progress is so quick, if you can call it progress. I think there's a few questions to answer here. The first is, this is a new thing. It feels new, but do we need new legislation, or do we have kind of legislative tools already that we can apply to these kinds of harms? So something I didn't touch on earlier about the Online Safety Act is the scope of the Act. How do you decide whether you need to comply with the Act or not? And the Act applies to a few kinds of services. User-to-user services, which are basically services where users can message each other, comment, upload content, like things, etc., where users can interact with each other. It applies to search services, and it applies to something called Part 5 services, which are basically porn services. That was a kind of later addition to the Act because it was pointed out to parliamentarians that if you just have user-to-user services, if there's a porn site where it's not the users uploading content, but the site itself is publishing content, that wouldn't have been captured. So that's kind of stuck on to the Act in a slightly, maybe a slightly clunky manner, a bit down the line. So the first thing to do would be think, okay, we've got these chatbots which are engaging in sexual conversations or encouraging young people to, do bad things, take part in harmful behaviors. How does that fall within the scope of the Act already? I don't necessarily know the answer to that because frankly, I don't know if I know enough about these specific chatbots and where they sit within a service and how much, what's happening. But if they are within scope of the Act, then you would need to do one of these risk assessments for these chatbots. You would need to do that really thoroughly. And frankly, I would find it staggering if, you can do something called, you can war game or red team or whatever you want to call it, have people within your company pretend to be different kinds of person and then have different kinds of conversations with these chatbots. You could then get evidence about what kind of thing is coming out of this chatbot. Is that appropriate to allow children to have access to? You'd probably immediately say, no, it's not. Right. So, if it's within scope of the Online Safety Act, again, I think the thing to do would be interrogate what risk assessments have been done before releasing these chatbots. And I would actually quite like to flip the question over to all three of you, because in regulation, one approach you can take, which Australia has been taking to social media, is called a precautionary principle, where you say, frankly, we know that this can cause harm, and we do not know enough about it yet to think about how to deploy it in a responsible way that isn't going to cause harm. And so for now, we're going to take a precautionary approach, and we're going to say, you should not have access to this if you're under a certain age. I'd be really interested if that's an approach that the three of you would advocate for with chatbots in general, because the thing we know about AI is it's really hard to police what the outputs of the AI are going to be. And you can manipulate the AI to give you outputs that it's been trained not to give you.
Yeah, can I just say on that, I agree. I think we should take an approach and regulate it so it's 16 plus, because AI is such a scary and unknown thing that I don't think any kind of risk assessment at this point would be able to prevent the harms that it could do to under 16s. And for the time being, until we get, as you say, more regulation around it and can better understand how we can regulate it properly, I think that it's worth the kind of whatever criticisms and consequences there are in terms of free speech. I think that's important.
I think I agree. I think as someone that was sort of involved with a bit of the development of the Online Safety Act, I sort of know how long everything took. And I think that especially on these chatbots, that you can't really be restricting their freedom of speech if they're not people. And so any sort of precautionary measures, there's no real infringement there, I don't think. And so I'd say that above anything else, if we're trying to protect children, if you can be even as young as 13 on Instagram accessing these things, I think that you have to prioritize the safety, because it's not even with, say you're just tweeting and maybe things get out of hand. If this is an AI, they don't have rights per se, at least not yet. And so I think you go to protecting the children, especially having witnessed so much of the harm that can happen in sort of prior advocacy positions and so on. If you know how bad it can get, I would personally do everything I could to prevent that happening in this sort of new wave of AI.
I definitely agree as well. I think it's something that we just don't have enough information on. This technology is progressing so rapidly that we really do need that restriction. Thank you so much for your answers on this section on the criticisms. I'm going to pass now on to Cosima, who's going to talk a little bit about how we're moving forward.
Thanks so much, Kaz. Sorry, can I just jump in really quickly? Because I really want to emphasize the fact that you're asking me really great questions and I'm doing my best to answer them. But I think there are some areas where you're regulating the internet to try and make it a safer space for children and young people. You just need to talk to children and young people more. You need to put them in positions of power, bring them into government, to regulators or whatever, and give them actual statutory powers to advocate for what they want. Because it's all very well and good me going off and we do research projects into the effectiveness of safety tech and how harmful it might be, and we try and help platforms implement it in an appropriate way. But it's just really important that the people who this is meant to help can actually advocate for themselves and say what they want. Because there could be a whole policy debate raging around how you regulate chatbots, and children could just get completely overlooked in that. If there's a broad consensus among children and young people that we want this to be restricted to us, we think broadly this should be, there should be a 16 age gate or whatever it is. That should be a really key part of policy development, and it isn't enough at the moment.
No, thank you. I really I think we all appreciate that. I think so much of the time, sort of youth voice is left out of conversations about youth. And as I've been in this sort of youth advocacy space and online safety for 6 years now, done a lot of it, but a lot of it is sort of like a brief conversation, and you don't necessarily see where your inputs land. And so, yeah, I really, really support that. So yeah, now let's sort of maybe move forward a bit in terms of the strengthening or potential strengthening of the sort of legislative approaches. We discussed briefly these international approaches, whether it's Australia or the EU. We know that in Australia, they are or have banned social media for under 16s. There's also lots of discussion about social media and phone bans in the UK political sphere at the moment, within certain political parties. I've personally spoken with a couple of Australian actors in the past in terms of how they're planning to implement their approach of sort of banning these things. I'm wondering if you believe that smartphone bans and social media bans in other jurisdictions and potentially here can be effectively implemented, and if you think that's the right approach.
Yeah, I think there's almost a question before can they be effectively implemented, which is the right approach question. And again, it's a question that I would like to answer by talking to young people who have access to social media. I think this is an area where I would listen to the experts that I have done some work with before and, follow their work closely. Like there's Professor Sonia Livingston at the London School of Economics, there's the Five Rights Foundation. And I am quite sympathetic to the argument that completely withdrawing social media from young people is kind of punishing young people for the failures of tech companies to design their platforms more responsibly. That is my kind of instinctive response. Can you effectively police it and enforce it? This is a big kind of bold policy decision, right? And policy decisions like that are always going to be slightly messily implemented. I think if you do ban under 16s from having social media accounts, I would imagine that the long-term impact of that would be far fewer under 16s have social media accounts. Some under 16s do get social media accounts, and maybe there's negative consequences, like they are presumed to be over 16 all the time when they're actually under 16, and so they're not given age-appropriate experiences. I think that could be a risk. I suppose an advocate would argue that in the UK at the moment, you have to be 18 to purchase alcohol, and I really don't want to create a bad impression for anyone, but I got my hands on alcohol when I was younger than 18 before. It happened sometimes, but generally I purchased alcohol a lot more when I was over 18 just because it was a lot easier and simpler and more socially acceptable. So you are going to have workarounds and the rules are going to be broken sometimes. Yeah, I think for me, the question of can it be effectively implemented, the answer is maybe kind of. It will probably have some, be able to be implemented to some extent, and there may be positives to it. But the really important question is, should it happen? Is it a good idea at all in the first place? What I would say is, if it is going to happen, Julie Inman-Grant, who's the e-safety commissioner in Australia, who again is independent from the Australian government and isn't the person responsible for this decision being taken, is one of the most kind of competent leaders in the online safety space out there. and I think has a really good grasp on the importance of listening to children and involving children in policy decisions. So if it can happen effectively anywhere, I think it probably is Australia under Julie's leadership.
Thank you so much. I think appreciate that insight. I think the idea that a ban, whilst it might not be 100% effective, it is that sort of nudge that can sort of reduce people in doing things that have been legislated against. But it is such a big debate whether or not it is fair to punish young people for sort of the dangers they've been exposed to by people sort of beyond their scope. And definitely that if it's going to happen, Australia is probably the place. And our sort of next question is, we'd like to know sort of a bit about your thoughts on like addictive algorithms and so on. So we've heard about the Safe for Kids Act in New York, which aims to protect children online by limiting social media platforms' ability to use addictive algorithms on users under 18, such as regulating like endless scrolling and personalized algorithms. Do you think that an approach like that sort of regulates how the platform works, a bit like you were talking about earlier with that sort of root cause addressal, do you think that's something that could be effective in the UK? And do you think it's something that could be achievable?
Yes, I think so. The Safe for Kids Act in New York is really interesting because it feels like it's trying to address the root causes of online harms, right? But it's still, using a relatively blunt instrument, which is we're going to switch this off for under 18s using age assurance to figure out who is or isn't an under 18. That's pretty much it. If you want to really address the root causes, you have to go back further, I think, and look at the business models of these companies. What is the fundamental business model that leads to the addictive algorithm? Because for me, I'm sure, there's tons of research done on to what extent are algorithms addictive and how does that lead to harm. That's really important. I don't think as soon as you turn 19, you're magically immune from that. And I don't think as soon as you hit 30, you're magically immune from that. I think the same is true for all online harms. So if we want to talk about regulating to fix root causes, this is where I'm really interested in the idea of industrial policy that I was talking about earlier. So I'm really interested in something called data cooperatives, which is where instead of, I don't want to get too nerdy here or anything, but instead of your data being effectively extracted from you by the tech platform and then sold to the highest bidder without you having any agency in that decision-making process, under a data cooperative, you would have decision-making power over how your data is governed. You might have democratically elected representatives. This all sounds a bit far-fetched at the moment, but you might have democratically elected representatives who kind of draw up data governance structures. So what does that mean? It means, how are we allowing our data to be monetized? How do we not want our data to be monetized? And then you can once you kind of start to open up space for data cooperatives, you might see different business models emerging. I think business models where people, pay for a bit more of the content they consume might not always be a bad thing. We've been really used to a free, open internet. There's this kind of libertarian vision of the internet that emerged in the 90s. As I've said, I'm on the left, I'm a progressive, I'm really sympathetic to some aspects of libertarian ideals. But if the result is that we're turned into these kind of data subjects that are harvested and distorted and manipulated in order to have value extracted from us, and every single time we lose half an hour we could have spent reading a book, doom scrolling, value is being extracted from us, opportunity taken from our future and kind of sent overseas to Silicon Valley, and we're never going to be contributing to our society or local community or anything with the time that we could have spent doing something more constructive. I've gone on a massive tangent here, but effectively what I wanted to say is the Safe for Kids Act is interesting. Again, we'll follow its progress with interest and, really interested to see how it works. I think a lot of states in the US have been passing various pieces of legislation, and then often it ends up in the Supreme Court and it's declared unconstitutional or not. And it's always a challenge for these states to try and make sure that, they're not violating the First Amendment, which is a big stumbling block for a lot of these pieces of legislation in the US. But yeah, if we're looking at root causes, I think it's not just about, restricting tech companies or telling tech companies don't do this. I think it's about government investing and investing money into opening up spaces where alternative business models for tech platforms could start to flourish and take place. And this is true, not just in the tech sector, it could happen across the economy. It's already happening in energy, which I spoke about earlier, where we've got a national energy company. Instead of nationalizing the whole energy sector, the government is saying, we're going to build a nationalized energy company and it's going to compete with private energy companies. Just being a bit more imaginative like that, I think that's how you start to really tackle the root causes of these problems.
Thank you. I really like that approach. I think so much of the time with online safety, we're sort of trying to fight against this sort of status quo rather than changing it. And I think when we're, as young people invested in this space, I think we spend a lot of time sort of talking about these issues, but we're sort of, we're faced with a roadblock of, okay, we just have to sort of weave around what we have and try and sort of firefight it. And it's is that the right option? Or are we we want to have these big changes and increase protections? Do we take a different approach and try and sort of change the game? I think that's really interesting. Sort of on the back of that, I'd really like to hear that if you had a free run of things, what would you like to see the government sort of focusing on in terms of regulation beyond maybe we've heard about this sort of different system? Is there anything sort of specific you would like to see? And also, where do you see the role? I know earlier we mentioned sort of education a little bit and how it's not sufficient. It's not a sort of catch-all solution. We could say that about any policy. But we do hear a lot from parents who do want to sort of understand these things better. How do you think we can achieve that? Because there's a lot of parents who do want to be empowered to help their children, but they don't have those resources. They might not have the time. And so how do we sort of tackle that?
Good questions. The first one was kind of if I had a magic wand or if I was in government and could do something, and not the help set up or fund data cooperatives or anything. I think a big thing is what I was talking about earlier. How can we have confidence that the tools being used to get compliant with regulation are safe, are secure, are certified? I think where the state is mandating certain technologies be used, they definitely should fund research into them. They should maybe set up labs where, an independent party can test how effective they are or fund those to be set up. The kind of maturity of that landscape at the moment, I think, leaves a lot to be desired in some ways. So I think that's a really big thing. At the moment, just globally, we're seeing a lot of research funding dry up. It's a really hard time to do research into anything into online harms. And actually, when I set up Illuminate Tech, our main plan originally was to do, really interesting research where we thought there was more research needed into online harms and what's the best way to address them. We're building this tool now to make risk assessments much better, hopefully, and point towards better resources for companies, in part because it's so hard to get the funding from anywhere to do this research which needs to be done. So that's a big thing I would do if I was government, just fund research, certification, testing, standards. Education, there's so much. You probably need a whole new curriculum, right? I think the AI piece is really interesting. AI literacy is important, knowing what AI is and what it isn't, knowing that you can't necessarily trust it. Critical thinking skills are really important. How do you engage with content online? How do you understand what is a good, reliable source and what isn't? What to think about before sharing things like this. I've actually seen somewhere recently the idea of a kind of driver's license for the internet. So the way we learn to drive a car, and then you get your driver's license and you can hit the road. And it's a really interesting idea. I don't know if that means you restrict access to services until you have your driver's license. But just the idea that you should be kind of digitally literate before you engage with these services is really interesting, I think. So those are a few high-level ideas. I think misinformation, disinformation is really important. But really important is sex and relationships education and understanding that the things you see online that maybe you're drawing on in your real-world relationships, that's just not real life. That's entertainment.
Thank you so much for all of those ideas. I think they're brilliant, especially the driving license thing. I think I've come across that briefly before with some other sort of youth discussions on these ideas, and I think it's such a cool idea. I remember at school we used to have pen licenses or something when you were younger in order to not use a pencil anymore. And I mean, obviously that's quite trivial, but the idea of having to go through some kind of education before you have access to these things, I think is a really interesting idea. Now we're going to sort of flip the script and ask you for a bit of advice about Flipp Gen. So I think, Cass, if you want to start.
I will, yes. I'm going to ask about education. So if you were obviously a Gen Z digital rebel like we are, what key pieces of information about safety would you be wanting to educate Gen Alpha about?
I mean, after this, I kind of feel like you guys are the experts and I have no right to be trying to advise you on this. Yeah, I suppose a lot of what I've just said, there's the thinking carefully about the quality of the content you're seeing online and where it comes from. My partner is a journalist and gets frustrated sometimes about the fact that, you know, there's a lot of YouTubers and the way people can consume media is different, and that's all great and good. But there's also such a thing as journalistic process and like understanding the quality of your sources and digging into the facts and reporting on data in an appropriate way. And that can kind of get lost when you're consuming all your news from influencers and stuff like that. So I think that's really important. I also think tolerance for people who have different perspectives than you is really, really important. I think learning, I don't want to sound like a centrist dad, but learning to like disagree agreeably is really important. And holding space for other people's flaws or where other people say things wrong or misunderstand something. I think understanding that things people say are not necessarily who they are. And I think what I see online a lot and how online discourse plays out is whatever you say is attached fundamentally to who you are. And therefore, if you say something wrong, you fundamentally as a person deserve, you know, public shaming or ridicule. So creating that kind of tolerance for people having opinions and challenging the opinions without fundamentally attacking the person, I would love to see a bit more of that.
I'm just going to quickly ask about regulation. We're building for us, we've done our manifesto. If you were kind of a rebel, what would you be calling for the government, like a specific call that we can ask the government for as part of that manifesto?
Have you heard of citizens' assemblies? So just for the benefit of anyone who hasn't, this was like an idea that was posed during the kind of Brexit debates after the referendum, where you'd basically get a group of people together, members of the public together. You'd get experts to inform them about the facts of a particular issue. And then that kind of random assembly of people, so people would be called up like you're called up for jury duty, just randomly from a community, they would come to decisions on things. It's just another form of democratic decision making. The technical term is sortition, and it's a very old form of democratic decision making with roots back in ancient Athens, I think. Anyway, having citizens' assemblies for kids where you just choose a random selection of kids from a particular community, say from London. You're called up from your schools, you're taken out of school one day, you're provided with facts on an online safety issue by experts, so you have a level of information that you need to be able to think about the facts clearly, and then have a discussion as a group, a guided discussion, come to outcomes, and then have those outcomes listened to and taken seriously by government. Because I don't want to say this is the demand you should make of government. And so what I would say is demand the forums where you can come to a set of clear demands and have those listened to by government and have government set up those spaces where that can take place. So that would probably be a suggestion that I feel comfortable making as someone who's not actually a member of your generation.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really fab suggestion, making those spaces for government to actually meaningfully listen to young people and do something about it, I think is definitely something that we want to call for. Aside from this, my last set of questions, more about collaboration. Aside from this fab podcast episode, what could a future with George and Illuminate Tech and Flipp Gen look like? Is there anything that you would be open to doing, or any way you think you could support the For Us movement, anything like that?
I really like activism. I really think it's important, and I'm in awe of what you guys are doing. I think it's so great. I think it's really important that people realize that if you organize and strategize, you can actually make an impact on the world, because, you know, cynicism and apathy is the enemy of progress. Think anything I can do, just supporting, giving encouragement. So on the side, outside of Illuminate Tech, I'm running this campaign which is trying to build solidarity for the trans community, particularly among cis communities. And the theory of change is really clear. It's have a specific set of demands, which it sounds like you have a really specific person you're asking to enact those demands who has the power to, make it happen, which it also sounds like you have, and then have a strategy to gradually increase pressure on those people who you're asking for things from. So anything we can help to do to kind of clarify that pipeline of activity, I would love to help with as well.
Thank you so much. That's very promising to hear. And we can't wait to sort of get involved with anything and have all of your guidance. That'd be brilliant. I guess it's time to close with a little summary of what we've talked about today. Flipp Gen believes in sort of no tech with a K rather than no tech. With the key being to sort of educate yourself and the next generation. And we really feel like this podcast today with you has done that by democratizing the Online Safety Act a little bit, helping people understand it and getting those conversations going. We think that's been really, really fabulous. It's clear that digital regulation is far better than an unregulated digital world, but there's clearly lots to think about in terms of strengthening that regulation. We think it's essential to listen to youth voice as you do. And so we encourage everybody to check out flipgen.com and forus.org.uk to learn a bit more about what we're doing and get involved. George, it's been wonderful to talk with you today. Good luck with Illuminate Tech, and a huge thank you for speaking to us.
Thank you so much, guys. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.